Right, good morning and welcome back to another Darwinex Labs tutorial. We'll be covering optimizing MetaTrader performance and trade latency on VPS servers. Before we continue, some clarifications here. So this tutorial will center around VPS servers employing Windows operating systems. It is possible to run MetaTrader via emulation environments on Linux and macOS via Wine and Parallels respectively. However, in today's context, we'll be focusing on Windows, and VPS servers that normally employ Windows OS tend to use Windows Server 2012 or thereabouts, or other variants of the Windows operating system. The contents of this discussion apply to all variants of Windows operating systems, so there shouldn't be anything specific to one variant versus another that should impact your ability to use what you learn here. We often get questions from users centered around MetaTrader performance, particularly from algorithmic traders who are using VPS servers to keep their strategies running 24/7, so they don't have to deploy their own machines or physically maintain their terminals. And those issues center around performance and can be categorized into two main categories of issues: computational and operational. And we'll talk about those shortly. In terms of operational issues, those are particularly to do with how those traders are configuring their VPS environments. So in today's tutorial, what we'll do is we'll focus on the things that can happen to a MetaTrader instance or a number of MetaTrader instances on a VPS server, common problems, causes of those problems. We've divided those causes into computational and operational, and how you can go about resolving those issues to obtain significantly better performance out of your MetaTrader environments on VPS servers using Windows operating system variants. So a list of problems that we've compiled based on feedback we've received from users tends to be along these lines. So freezing or lagging during higher volatility hours of the trading day is an issue experienced by some users. And this particular problem is usually experienced by users who have multiple charts open and also are active during high volatility hours. Now, during high volatility hours, you have lots and lots of tick data running through your terminal. If you have more than one chart with multiple programs running on it, such as EAs, expert advisors, scripts, etc., then because it is event-driven and each time a tick is received, an event is fired. And if you have more than one program running, then all those programs will be processing that tick. And hence, during high volatility times, when you have lots of data going through the terminal, because the market's moving quite rapidly, that's when generally there is resource overload, or at least stress applied to the computational resources you have available to you on your VPS. That's one reason. The other reasons we'll go through shortly. So freezing or lagging behavior during higher volatility hours of the day is one problem that's been reported on occasion. High CPU and RAM usage by MetaTrader is another one. Then orders can take longer to execute when this happens, when MetaTrader is behaving in this way, or the symptoms being experienced by it are causing it to behave this way. Tick data on charts, as I mentioned, takes longer to update as well, particularly during higher volatility hours, if the system is under strain like that, but generally can happen too if the system is generally under strain due to misconfiguration or improper use of resources available to the VPS. Then we have charts with multiple indicators cause significant performance deterioration as well. We'll talk about these in a bit more detail shortly as to why that is the case and how you can configure your environment differently to at least mitigate some of the impact or more of this particular issue. Other issues include expert advisors lagging or freezing or missing trading opportunities as a result of this, of course, preferred prices of entry, things like that. And then there are users who have experienced all those problems that we just went through above, and all of the above on VPS servers with multiple virtual CPU cores. Now, something we'll talk about in this tutorial is why having more virtual CPU cores does not translate to more CPU power when MetaTrader 4 is concerned. And we'll go through the specifics of this shortly. So that's those 7 issues that we've just discussed are summarized quite well the host of problems that have been reported over time. And with this tutorial, hopefully we can help users resolve them all on their own. So we've divided the causes behind these problems into 2 main themes. One is computational and the other is operational. Computational is where the physical resources available to you on your VPS are the reason for the limitation. And operational is when the trader, the way you've configured the environment, creates the limitations. So we'll go through the operational limitations first so that you gain a general understanding of how to go about configuring your environment so you don't experience these issues. And also, these operational issues apply to a large majority of people who've reported the 7 summarized gist of issues we talked about earlier. So discussing the operational issues first should hopefully assist those users effective immediately. So the first thing you can do, the first thing that causes these particular issues is that too many indicators being deployed on a single chart can cause slowdown. Too many custom indicators used by any one expert advisor can cause the same. Or if you have too many expert advisors deployed to a single MT4 terminal, that too can cause an issue. One expert advisor can be applied to one chart at any given time, and each expert advisor has its own thread during that execution period. And slowdown can also occur if too many expert advisors are attempting to call trade functions in MT4 concurrently. Now, something that a lot of algorithmic traders employing VPS servers with MetaTrader don't necessarily know off the get-go is that there is a trade context, and that trade context is singular for the entire terminal, as in any one EA can access trading functionality at any given time. And if more than one EA, an expert advisor, attempts to access trade functionality, trade-related methods, then it will lead to a context busy error, as in the context will not permit more than one EA to access trading functionality. And it's also common for this error to be misinterpreted by users as a broker side issue. Normally, the trade context busy error, the error 146, is a physical error presented by the terminal itself that you may not access trading functionality, as in you being the EA. If more than one EA is trying to access trade functionality, trade context busy will be raised that, sorry, someone else is using the trade context at the present time for trading functionality. So if trade context busy has surfaced for you, this is most certainly a client-side issue, and we'll talk about how to mitigate this shortly as well. Then there are a few operational things, how you use MetaTrader on your VPS that can assist with reducing the load on your instance, both the terminal as well as the VPS server itself, especially if you're using more than one chart, and even more especially if you have multiple indicators or expert advisors running on that terminal, multiple indicators running on each chart in that terminal. So the first thing you can do is, if you are an algorithmic trader who is executing a strategy on a particular set of assets, then MetaTrader by default has a market watch window. We're just going to flip over to the MetaTrader screen here, close this window here, and keep market watch open. By default, you'll have a list of assets that are already open. And if in your trading strategy you're not executing, or you don't require data or don't require visibility of any sort on each and every asset available to you via the terminal, then it makes no sense to have all the assets have their bid, ask, and any other parameters that you've enabled here to be updated in real time. This consumes resources, and if you're not interested in more than a few assets that you're trading, then it makes no sense to have those assets available to you on the VPS. You can, of course, have a physical instance of MetaTrader installed on your local machine, your laptop or personal computer, and watch all of these symbols there where resource requirements may be different according to what you're doing with that machine. But the thing to do here is to simply hide all. That gets rid of everything except the chart that's open, in this case, euro dollar. And then assuming that you have one symbol that you're trading, then it's just that symbol that you need to have here. This will significantly reduce the amount of processing going on inside the terminal in terms of capturing bid and ask data, as well as the bid and ask spread that's being calculated in real time, and any other sort of variables that you've enabled in these columns. The next thing to do is, if, however, you have more than one symbol that you're trading and you'd like that to be visible to you in MarketWatch, then simply go ahead and select that symbol or that list of symbols instead of having all the symbols show. So in our case, let's assume that we have a strategy that's trading the euro dollar and pound dollar as well as the dollar yen. In our case, since we already have the euro dollar enabled, I'm going to go ahead and choose the GBP dollar as well here. Click on show. And then finally, we'll locate the dollar yen and also click on show, and then we'll click close. Now we have the three assets that we are interested in, because these are the three that are being traded by our strategy and for which we'll need to open charts or not, depending on the expert advisor, the way it's been written. So we'll go through that shortly as to how expert advisors can be written in a manner that renders it unnecessary to have the EA deployed on each chart as well. But this is the first basic operational step that you can do, and it's fairly simple. It requires nothing outside of MetaTrader. You simply need to hide all symbols that you don't have no interest in for this particular strategy, and only maintain visibility over the ones that you are trading. That's the first step. Let's go back to the remainder of the operational causes. Then after the market watch, we have charts that have, so MetaTrader comes with some default options, and these, for charts, two of these options are max bars in history and max bars in chart. These default values are significantly high, and they're meant for obviously allowing you to visualize a lot more data in your chart. For instance, if we go back here in this chart, the max bars in history and max bars in chart being high by default allow you to see a fairly reasonably large amount of history in your chart. But when you're on a VPS, you don't need all of this information unless your EA or indicator specifically requires that a chart have this information to hand. So if that's not the case, then what you can do is go to Tools and click on Options and go to Charts, and over here you see these two values. Now my default values are quadruple nine for all of them, because I, on this local machine, would like to have access to as much data in my history and my chart as possible. But because we're not on a VPS here, on a VPS, unless you have a specific requirement for max bars in history and max bars in chart, what you can do here is set them to 1 each, and that will essentially just load the most recent bar worth of data onto your chart when you're configuring your environment. So that's another operational thing you can do to mitigate some of the the overhead that comes along with having everything displayed with large quantities of data being pulled from history as well as back onto the chart. Then further on, we have period-wise scrolling, and by default there are two. So there's left and there's right period-wise scrolling, and let me go show you where this is. These two buttons up here. Scroll the chart to the end on tick incoming, and then shift end of the chart from the right border. So if there is no particular need to scroll each time and update the chart each time, then you can also save some additional resource overhead by disabling these two entirely. This way your chart will remain static, and if you've already gone into Tools, Options, and set these max bars in history and max bars in chart to 1, and you've double reduced, if that's even a term, the overhead associated with getting data into your chart and hence into memory and updating the screen each time, which requires CPU power. So you've reduced your memory footprint as well as your CPU footprint by doing that. So that's another operational thing you can do there. Then by default, news and sound resources are also enabled in MetaTrader. So again, if you're running this on a VPS server, your objective is to run, most likely your objective is to run an algorithmic trading strategy for which you don't need access to news and sounds, because there's really not much point in having sounds go off on your VPS server when you're not looking at it, or if for any reason you you would like to listen to those sounds, you can do that on your laptop or on your PC. To disable those, we very simply go to Events and uncheck this Enable box here. And this takes away all the sound actions that would have gone off had that been the case. So that takes care of that. Now let's go back to our list, and finally more charts being open and updating in real time in the terminal than you need cause all of the above problems or more. If you're running MT4 on a VPS, as I mentioned earlier, chances are that you're trading algorithmically. And expert advisors ideally should access symbol and trading data for any assets from within one EA, as opposed to having the same EA installed on multiple charts. This is more for the programmer. If you are the programmer, then you'd be advised to access symbols from within your EA instead of having your code apply to the current symbol the EA is deployed on. And the reason for this is to essentially create a performance optimization for yourself, where in backtesting, while it may be useful for you to use the symbol method in MetaTrader MQL4 and MQL5 to access symbol data so that you can backtest your trading strategy across multiple assets, singularly in MetaTrader 4 and as a combination, as a portfolio in MetaTrader 5 if you wish. In both those cases, you'd be applying the symbol function. But when you are taking your strategy to production, it makes a lot more sense to modify it so that it can access any symbol data and hence execute trades on any symbol, as opposed to you having to deploy it on each and every chart that it's meant for. This saves you resources in terms of the number of charts that are open, the number of things that are deployed on the charts, the amount of processing power and memory that is going into maintaining all of those activities. And hence that's a very important note here. And if your EA doesn't do this, then you should modify it to do so. Or if you're not the author, then request the author to conduct that modification. So those are the operational issues that we've just covered. Now let's go over to some of the computational issues to do specifically with MetaTrader 4. And these are not immediately apparent to users, particularly first-time VPS users, or to users who may be very proficient and very experienced with using VPS servers and being algorithmic traders for years on end, but who don't necessarily have too much insight into how MetaTrader 4 actually functions and what its particular computational specifics are. So to shed some brief light on that, enough for you to be able to deal to some problems that you may encounter, such as the ones we discussed earlier, are that multiple cores on VPS servers are virtualized. They're virtual, and they create performance issues for MetaTrader 4 as it's a 32-bit application. The important thing to note is that when you're looking for a VPS server, when you're selecting a configuration for your VPS server, just remember that more virtual cores does not translate to more power for MetaTrader 4. And why that is, we'll go through shortly in a bit more detail, just a tad more. Secondly, indicators in MetaTrader 4, and this is another computational thing to remember, is that they share the same graphics interface thread. And the more indicators that you load on a single terminal, the greater the resource requirement for that terminal. So if you just look at these first two issues here, if you've got a 32-bit application running on a multiple virtual core machine, and then you have several indicators loaded per chart and you have multiple charts, then you're presenting your configuration with a lot of problems that you could avoid by making some changes we'll talk about shortly. Another note as far as threads are concerned is that while each script and expert advisor runs in its own thread, so when you launch a new chart, and for example here we have a chart and you throw some indicator onto it, throw an expert advisor or a script onto it, they run in their own thread, their own execution thread. Trade operations, however, are single-threaded, and only one EA, as I mentioned earlier, can access a trade operation at any given time. And this results in the trade context busy error being raised if more than one EA attempts to access trading functionality. And also, as I mentioned, this is not a broker-side issue. It's very much a client-side issue, and it can be solved by employing some programming practices that I'll discuss with you shortly. Custom indicators These are called with the iCustom function. MQL programmers watching this video will be familiar with that. And they run in the same thread as the program that calls them, the program being the script or the expert advisor. And finally, the one thing that we shouldn't do, or we should try to avoid as best as possible, is to not do backtesting on a VPS. There are a few reasons for that. Firstly, most VPSs will come with virtualized cores if you're using a single CPU. If you have a multiple CPU configuration, that's a different story. The MT4 strategy tester is a single-threaded effort, and therefore it can't take advantage of multiple CPU cores. The MT5 strategy tester, however, this should be MT5, is multi-threaded. So that automatically mitigates the multi-threading issue that we just talked about. Just remember that the more custom indicators there are, the more indicators there are generally on your charts, the more computational stress the calling program, the indicator or the expert advisor or script are generating for your terminal. Now, in terms of solutions, how we deal to all of these issues, it's the operational as well as computational issues. These can be, if not resolved, mitigated to a fair extent and enough for you to get decent performance out of even a basic configuration VPS server. So as we discussed earlier, more virtual CPU cores do not equal more power as far as MetaTrader 4 is concerned. So ideally, what you want to do is choose a VPS with a more powerful single core CPU. As in a more powerful CPU with a single core, if that's possible. And the other thing is, if you do need to run lots of things, you need to have lots of charts open with an EA or a script that relies on indicators on those charts, then it's important that you don't run every single thing on one MT4 terminal. And instead, you could split up your charts, indicators, and EAs among multiple MT4 instances, and then deal to them in terms of processing, as I'll talk about shortly here. So you can do one or two things or test both to see which affords you better performance. The first thing is you can assign each MT4 instance to the same CPU core on your VPS server. So for example, if you have a VPS that comes with a CPU that has 4 cores, allegedly, those are 4 virtual cores. So you don't want MetaTrader 4 messing about with 4 virtual cores. In that case, what you can do is if you have MetaTrader 4 running already, like we do here, but this is a local machine, we'll go to Task Manager. You right-click on your taskbar at the bottom of your screen in Windows. This is Windows 10. Click on Task Manager. And then inside Processes, find MetaTrader. Right-click on MetaTrader, go to Details. And once you're here, you'll see terminal.exe in this list. Right-click on this, click on Set Affinity. And if you have this default view where all CPU cores are engaged, then unselect them all and just assign the first one to MetaTrader. This will result in, when you go back to performance view, it will result in, for instance, let's change the graph to logical processors. Over time, as you run this, you'll see that one of your cores will be exhibiting more activity than the other. And this is because you've assigned your terminal to that one process. So as you can see, the levels are tapering off on the other cores, but they're maintained on the one core that we've assigned MetaTrader to, because MetaTrader is still running. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do is, if you would like to test the effect of assigning an MT4 instance to each core, if, for example, you have 50 charts you need to have open, and on each of those 50 charts, for instance, you have 10 indicators or so, I'm not necessarily certain why you would need such a configuration, but if you do, then what you could do is split up that activity. Instead of having 50 charts open with tens of indicators on the same terminal, perhaps have as many terminals as you have cores available. So if this was our VPS, for instance, we have 4 cores available to us. The second thing we can attempt to measure performance out of is to assign each terminal that we have. Imagine we have 4 of these open, to assign each terminal to a unique core. So in this case, we had MetaTrader 32, go to Details, right click here, Set Affinity. So I would set the first terminal to CPU 0, come back here for the second terminal, set it to 1, so on and so forth, until the number of cores I have are exhausted. However, if you have more terminals than you have cores, then it's probably advisable to either upgrade the specification of your VPS server to have additional CPUs and hence additional cores, or to separate your activities on different VPS servers with different CPUs altogether. The first option is one that is probably going to work better for some, where you choose a VPS with a more powerful single core CPU. But it would be good if you already have, I imagine that most people watching this will already have a VPS server where the VPS server most likely is not single core and has multiple cores. So in that case, you can either assign your MT4 instances to the same core as I showed you earlier, or assign different MT4 instances to different cores and see how that impacts your performance and go with the one that gives you better performance. Now here's the bit we talked about, we touched upon earlier as to trade context busy, when that is raised and what we can do about it. So to prevent the trade context busy error, which is error 146 in MQL, the programmers behind the EA, be that yourself or the author of the application you're using, need to implement the isTradeAllowed method to determine if an EA can trade at a given time or not. So if this is not implemented, then your EA may possibly attempt to access trading functionality when another EA, also running on the same terminal, attempts to access trading functionality. And if that happens, this error will be raised. In that case, you need to ensure that inside the logic of the EA is checking if those trading resources are even available to it or not. And if they're not, for it to wait, and you would need to have some logic that allows you to loop back and sleep for a bit or something to that effect, come back and try again later. Now, in terms of efficiency, as I mentioned earlier as well, running your backtest running any backtests inside a VPS server is not going to prove very useful and is going to run into issues, as the MetaTrader 4 strategy tester is a single-threaded effort. In that case, what you should just do is, if it's not possible for you to not backtest on your VPS, then you may need to invest in a more powerful VPS instance to have both the power for trading as well as backtesting, if both those things are a regular activity. Trading on its own, however, requires relatively fewer computational resources. So if you begin to rewire the way you configure your VPS, how you use it computationally as well as operationally, then you're likely to get better performance out of it. And if you're not backtesting, then you'll get decent performance overall. Now, only enable those assets, as I mentioned earlier, in MarketWatch that you actually need. Like we did over here, we hid the ones that we weren't in our example trading strategy, trading these three majors, the euro dollar, pound dollar, and dollar yen. And since we didn't need access to any of the others, we disabled them. And this gave us savings in computational resources by disabling bid and ask and any other variable updates to assets that we don't have an interest in for this particular strategy. Set max bars in history and max bars in chart, as I mentioned earlier, to the lowest possible number that your EA or indicator needs to function correctly. Now, why we say lowest possible number here is because there are some indicators, for instance, that may have a bars counted some sort of limitation in terms of the look back period. And in that particular case, depending on the logic of the indicator, either default or custom, you may need to have a certain amount of bars in history and on the chart to be able to ensure good function of those indicators. So hence the lowest possible being the minimum data required by your application. And if there is no minimum, then setting them to 1 will enable your chart to have a lot less data and hence reduce the memory footprint that your terminal is exhibiting on your VPS server. As we talked about earlier, disable news, sound, and chart auto scrolling to get a slight bit more efficiency out of your usage. And finally, close any charts that aren't being used by an EA indicator or script. And this is because it is a VPS at the end of the day. If your objective is to use the VPS for algorithmic trading, is to automate your strategy and not be logged into it all day long, there's really no need to have any additional charts open that are only consuming resources as far as MetaTrader is concerned. So that pretty much sums up what we talked about. We talked about problems that have been reported to us in terms of efficiency, performance, and optimization issues. The two categories of problems that you can run into, operational and computational, and how to go about solving them to get a bit more efficiency out of your configuration and to essentially just have a better experience and hence also reduce trade latency. Remember that if you have slow terminals, if you have freezing and lagging going on, then orders could take longer to execute because either there's a trade context related problem in terms of how your EAs are accessing trading functionality on the same terminal, but it could also be because the system is so overloaded, if you're overloading it this way, that it is generally slower, and hence the orders that the time at which you're executing your orders, the time at which the order is being passed through to the broker is being impacted by those physical issues being experienced by the system, due to the stress being imposed on the system. So by making certain changes to the way you use your VPS server, as well as developing an understanding of MetaTrader for a few of its internals, a few specifics to do with it. For example, it's a 32-bit application, and the threading sort of constraints by script advisor and expert advisor and indicator, you can develop a better understanding of how to go about approaching the terminal and hence using it for algorithmic trading, especially on a VPS server. And finally, in terms of computational resources, again, you can also improve your ability to select a good VPS server. So when selecting a VPS server, just know that more cores does not translate to more power when MetaTrader 4 is concerned. And it's always a better idea to choose a single core CPU that has a lot more power than one that has less power but multiple virtual cores. These problems we've discussed today, as well as the causes and solutions, of course, are specific to MetaTrader 4 and not to MetaTrader 5, and as far as computational constraints are concerned, because MetaTrader 5, as I talked about earlier, is indeed a multi-threaded application and resolves a lot of the issues that are discussed in this tutorial today. So thank you very much for your attention. See you in the next tutorial. As always, if you enjoyed this presentation, please do consider sharing it with your social networks, colleagues, co-workers, and friends. And do subscribe to the Darwinex YouTube channel so you remain up to date with all future videos that will be released in this series and other topics discussed on Darwinex. Thank you very much for your attention. See you next time.